Thanks everybody for uh, hosting us today and for coming. For coming as we host Professor Omarova, I should say. It's a real pleasure and an honor to have Professor Omarova with us. I think I think a lot of people, when they think of the University of Cincinnati College of Law, think of some of the wonderful institutes that we have and some of the things that we're really known for. Things like the Ohio Innocence Project, of course, and the Jones Center, and the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights. And these are things that we're really, really proud of. One that I think hasn't gotten quite as much attention, I think really deserves a lot of it, is our focus on corporate law and our corporate law center. And the wonderful work that Sean Mangan has done. We're investing in that center. We're looking to see it expand. We have a number of corporate law fellows. And I think our distinguished visiting professor today really helps to demonstrate the extent to which we really are invested in this area and looking to move forward in it. And we're really delighted to have, as our distinguished visiting professor, really for the entire week, Professor Omarova. And it's a real pleasure. She's teaching a short course for us. And today, of course, she's going to be providing a really interesting lecture on fintech and the challenges that it presents to financial regulation. So I won't extend her CV too long because I could talk for the entire period just talking about all of her achievements. But she has a philosophy degree from Moscow State University, which is, you don't always associate with financial fintech gurus, but there it is. JD is from Northwestern and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. So deep roots in the Midwest as well. Professor Omarova currently serves as the Beth and Mark Goldberg Chair, Professor of Law at Cornell University, and she's held a number of distinguished positions, including a visitor professor at Yale Law School, a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, a senior fellow at the Berggruen Institute, and a distinguished visiting professor in a variety of different places around the world, including Torino and Toronto. In 2006 and 2007, she worked for the Department of Treasury, a special advisor for regulatory policy. So it gives you an example of Professor Omarova's achievements, not only in theory, but also really in the field. I mean, too many law review articles to mention, but Vanderbilt and Yale and Miami, Cornell, of course, Washington University, highly distinguished, real leader in the field of financial regulation and fintech and financial law sort of generally. So we're really honored to have her, and please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you so much, Dean, for this incredible, very kind, overly kind introduction. And thank you all for hosting me, giving me this chance to speak to you today about this topic of incredible importance, but also incredible complexity. I am an academic, much like some of you in this audience. And my job is, of course, to ponder about various big issues, big topics that occupy the minds of practitioners and policymakers out there. But the luxury of being an academic is, of course, the ability to step back and take kind of a big picture view, right? And sort of philosophize a little bit about what some of the daily occurrences in the world of law and business and regulation may portend in the longer run for the society as a whole. And so with your indulgence, I thought that today I would share with you some of my thoughts, tentative as they might be, about what the financial technology, which is a very broad term, which I use broadly, sort of as an umbrella term, encompassing things like crypto, tokenization, digitization of finance, perhaps artificial intelligence in the world of finance, but also more mundane things, just like, for example, the use of greater computing capabilities in the delivery of traditional financial services. So what all of this fintech, financial technology, as a phenomenon, bringing in or promising to bring in for us as people interested in financial regulation. This is people like me, that's my world. So financial technology as a regulatory challenge, this is the, I don't think this is working. Technology is a challenge, not only a regulatory. Anyway, while the experts are coming to my rescue. So the fundamental question, really kind of basic question that a lot of us in the world of financial regulation kind of start with is with the advent of all this new fancy crypto technology that sounds almost like a game, right? What is it that we should focus on? What is the regulatory task here? Should we regulate technology, this new shiny thing that most of us in the world of financial regulation do not really quite understand very well? Should we regulate technology as it applies to finance, which we know and understand? At least we hope so, right? Or should we actually still keep focus on regulating finance, the thing we always have been focused on, the thing that we fancy ourselves as having a better knowledge of, but can I move back? Okay, oh, thank you. Or should we regulate finance as it's enabled by new technology? And whenever we pose this question in any kind of audience, the answer, of course, as you might surmise, inevitably and very quickly is absolutely we have to regulate finance as enabled by technology. As a matter of fact, a lot of financial regulators, policymakers keep talking about their regulatory efforts being technology neutral, which means technologies come and go, they change. What we really focus on is financial relationships, financial services, the behavior, the conduct in financial markets. So far, so good. Fine, nobody's going to argue with that. Gives me a great comfort to know that I don't have to become a technologist. We're still regulating finance. But what does that mean? This is where things get a little bit more difficult, but not just yet. Because when we ask ourselves, what does it mean to regulate finance as it's enabled by new technologies? Then typically the immediate answer comes, well, we need to be able to incorporate new technologies into the existing regulatory framework or frameworks, because we have several, right? So examples of questions that arise in that vein include, for instance, are these new crypto tokens actually securities? Should we qualify them as such and therefore regulate them as such? Are cryptocurrencies really money? Should they be regulated as other forms of money? For example, bank deposits. Those are the forms of money that we know and regulate very well. Is algorithm or smart contract, for instance, right? Is it really a contract as a legal concept? Or is it just a piece of software that operates as if it were a contract? Those are the questions that a lot of lawyers in private practice, in government agencies, lawyers in academia have been grappling with and figuring out answers to. And that debate keeps going on. And it's a very, very important line of inquiry. But is it all we need to ask ourselves? Or is it all that we need to focus on? How to incorporate tokens into the existing securities framework or tokens into the existing currency regulation or money regulation framework? Or should we really ask a bigger question? Are we in fact facing a deeper and more complex issue or dilemma, right? Because in my view, fintech is disrupting not simply a particular set of regulatory regimes. For example, the securities regulation that we know, or the banking regulation as we know it. Fintech, financial technology, in all of its various aspects, is fundamentally disrupting the underlying paradigm of modern financial regulation. And that is the bigger issue, the bigger problem that we, all of us, securities lawyers, practitioners, and banking lawyers, and academics and policymakers ultimately have to face and have not yet had the chance to really engage with, right? So is it time to revisit the paradigm of financial regulation, which immediately sort of raises another question. Well, what is the paradigm of financial regulation that we currently have? People know what the paradigm of securities regulation, for example, is, right? People may know what the general approach or paradigm of bank regulation is. But paradigm of financial regulation as an umbrella concept is harder to define, right? So at some point, I took a stab at trying to figure out what is it that unites the generalized approaches, the fundamental attitude to how we regulate financial transactions, financial markets, financial institutions across these different areas in which practitioners operate typically, right? So before we do that, let me take a very quick step back and talk a little bit about what the financial system is. So financial system, we don't really think about it much other than in functional terms, right? If you open a textbook, any textbook, be it a finance textbook or economics textbook or whatever, will probably list all these functions that the financial system performs for individuals, right? It allows us to save our resources for future use, to transfer money, to engage in a variety of economic transactions, and so on and so forth. But as an institutional construct, financial system can also be understood as a form of public-private partnership. In other words, there are private actors that inhabit financial markets. There are a lot of them, and they're very diverse. But there are also important public actors, government actors operating at various levels that also perform very important functions for the maintenance and operation of these financial markets, right? So private actors fundamentally are responsible for or have the power to allocate credit throughout the economy. It's because those institutions, meaning banks, investment banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, fund managers, mutual fund managers, individual investors, corporate treasurers, and so on and so forth, private actors, they are the ones who decide which financial instruments to put out there in the market, when to issue what kind of securities, stocks, bonds, how to price them, whether or not to invest in those securities, for example, right? Whether or not to borrow, whether or not to lend, and whatnot. In our exchange economy, it's not the government that makes those decisions. Those decisions are properly left to the determination of private markets because we believe in the superior ability of private actors, private economic actors on the ground to judge what to do and how to do it best, meaning, where should the credit flow and under what conditions. But the public actors are responsible for maintaining the overall systemic stability in the financial realm, right? The macro stability. They modulate the amount of credit that is emitted by private actors into that system. So, for example, if you left it completely to the decisions of multiple private institutions, private banks, private asset managers, private corporations, all of those decisions of how much leverage to create in the system, right? How much credit to create in the system, and so on and so forth. It may very well become very unstable, right? At some points, there would be too much issuance of various financial instruments, and at other times, it will dwindle down to next to nothing. And so inflation, for example, is another big issue in this respect. So public actors like, for example, central banks that are in charge of monetary policy, their job is to essentially keep a watchful eye on the state of the financial and monetary system and to make sure that whatever it is that private market actors are deciding to do, however much money and credit they decide to emit into the universe, into the economy, and wherever that money flows, wherever that capital goes, wherever those investments go, there isn't no overissuance. There isn't any overissuance of those claims, and there is nothing that is likely to disturb the overall stability of the market. So in effect, what's happening here is that we allow private firms that are driven by the pursuit of private profit, quite legitimately so, right, to decide how much credit to create and where to send that credit and under what conditions and with what timing. But it's the public entities that are responsible for making sure that none of these disparate, very decentralized economic decisions actually blow up the system or bring it to the brink of a potential disaster, right? And that sort of division of labor, perhaps maybe it reminds some of you. I see that, many of you are of the cohort that probably already have raised children, right? So sometimes when you have teenage children, right, you give them a lot of power to make their own decisions because that's what it means, right? To have children who are growing up and they're much savvier than we are with technology and with all of these new shiny things that are out there. But ultimately, it's our responsibility to make sure that they don't run into trouble. And more importantly, if we, for example, give them our credit card, right, they don't ruin the credit of the entire family. And you could probably extrapolate in a very basic way, right, what kind of challenges that creates for the parent. Right? You can't really control upfront where they go, what they do, and what kind of risks they take. You have to trust them. You create all kinds of controls, right? Whatever, curfews or, please call me when you're out late or whatnot. Whether or not they actually always do it, who knows? But ultimately, it's sort of that system that is a very fragile balance. So what happens in the financial system with the public actors and private actors is somewhat like that, right? And the financial regulation is meant to be the balancing mechanism. It's that set of rules that kind of like the curfew for the kids and requirement of calling or whatnot, that is meant to be followed by the private actors as they go about extending credit, issuing securities, making investments, pricing financial claims, and so on and so forth, and making the economy run effectively, right? So that those activities do not blow up the entire edifice of the national economy. So the model of that regulation, that balancing mechanism, however, is of a very particular kind. And I call it a technocratic model of financial regulation. That's what we have right now. That model has evolved historically, probably dating back to the mid-19th century, but really it has taken shape of the kind that we are familiar with today during the New Deal era in the 1930s, when the federal securities regulation was put in place, when a lot of modern bank regulation in the United States was put in place. And there are certain features of that approach, of that paradigm, of how that balancing mechanism between the private actors in the financial markets creating financial claims, allocating credit, and the public actors whose job it is to maintain the stability of the financial system and also to make sure that the credit actually flows into the real economy, because that is, after all, the function of the financial market. How to balance those interests, how to make sure that both parties are able to fulfill their functions without coming into conflict and getting into each other's way, right? That choice of how to go about it could have been made in a different way. But what we have today is something of this kind. First of all, our financial regulation is highly structurally segmented. We have different silos, regulatory silos. We don't have a single regulatory scheme that basically says that we don't care what you call yourself, a bank or a schmenk. And we don't care what kind of financial product you sell or you provide, whatever you call it crypto, you call it token, you call it stock, or whatever it is. What we care about is that this is part of what we broadly understand as the financial market or investment market or capital market. And if that's the case, here is one set of rules for everybody, no matter what size, no matter what type of a business line you're in. We don't have that. Instead, historically, we have developed this approach to sort of looking at a particular type of a financial product or a financial service, and a particular type of a financial institution and entity, the kind of a firm, the kind of a business model that matches the provision of that particular financial service or that particular financial product. For example, a security makes everything that is related to the issuance, to the sale, transfer, custody, and any kind of manipulation or trading of that particular security, that particular product, a matter of securities regulation. And that is one silo, and it is a very important silo, where we know that we have the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, our federal regulator, we have state securities regulators, we have stock exchanges, we have an elaborate set of statutes and rules and the liability that attaches to violations and all of that stuff. And in the private practice, in legal practice, right, we have practice groups at law firms that specifically focus on capital markets. And when you talk to lawyers who practice in that field, they immediately would identify themselves as, I'm a securities lawyer. Do not talk to me about banking or insurance. That's because banking lives in a whole different silo. Because a product, a financial product that we understand as a banking product, like a deposit or bank loan, for example, or a variety of bank trust services, for example, right, have long been identified. That's the stuff that comes to us, well, from before the New Deal, from the 19th century. It's in those days when the most state-level banking statutes were written, and then they were extrapolated and basically replicated at the federal level, that defined what a banking business was. And the way they defined it was amazingly vague. Basically said banks will be chartered to engage strictly in the business of banking, which means issuing banknotes, which modern banks don't do anymore, lending on security and so on and so forth, making loans and whatnot, right? Similarly, with insurance products, there is a definition what an insurance product is, what qualifies as an insurance product, and if whatever you sell legally fits into that definition of an insurance product for purposes of insurance regulation, then you must go into that box, sit in that box, get that licensing, submit yourself to that regulatory regime, and all of that wonderful stuff. So this product-based, entity-based, licensing based structural segmentation is really baked into our regulatory system of regulatory oversight of finance. And it's kind of interesting because that creates rigidity, right? It creates certain assumption that product lines are set forever. It's kind of like that, was it the Hughes High School building here in Cincinnati? That wonderful old building. And the name of that building, high school, is actually set in stone on that building. This is how they built in the old days, right? They thought that things will never change. Things, of course, do change. But we have that structural segmentation because once a particular regulatory paradigm takes place, it becomes institutionalized. Those structural silos create their own institutional actors and vested interests. Bureaucratic expertise becomes the defining characteristic of how the public actors go about overseeing financial system, right? So the SEC, securities lawyers, those people who work at the SEC, their expertise is geared toward that world in which securities exchange hands. And they are essentially digging deeper into that world. And that is what they do. And that is the expertise they accumulate. And that is who essentially runs that world. That's who oversees that world. Same with the banking world. Same with insurance and whatnot. Bureaucratic expertise becomes extremely important. And the bureaucrats acting within those silos, whenever they encounter particular regulatory challenges or problems, right? The fundamental mode of reaction to that new question, new problem, is not let's step outside of my silo and surveil the entire new changing landscape of the financial market and see where does this question come from, what else does it implicate. Instead, the mode of operation is that we need to actually burrow down further, deeper, find the simplest, the most fundamental, the narrowest, technically precise type of a market failure, specific problem that we can surgically address with the tools that we already have within that structure that presumes the segmentation of different parts of the financial market, right? So that means that bureaucrats, we call them bureaucrats, financial regulators, securities regulators, bank regulators, insurance regulators, right? They are averse, fundamentally averse to taking that bigger kind of structural systemic view that goes outside of their silo of expertise. And their natural inclination and very strong bias is actually to define every regulatory problem in the most granular microtransactional terms, with that they feel that they're equipped to address surgically with the tools that they already have. They also feel that that's how they protect themselves from liability should, for example, some aggrieved market actor come after them and said, you're acting in an arbitrary and capricious manner, right? So there are all these kind of rational and very much structural factors that, that determine the reaction of financial regulators to anything new and anything that kind of presents a problem. So fintech, however, is a big change. Up to now, financial technology has always been a big pressure or source of pressure on financial regulation, right? Beginning in the 1980s, when the computing power really grew, for the first time, those big banks and Wall Street firms were able now to run or create models that started that gave them the ability now to price and project the various values and various prices for various complex financial products that previously were considered kind of very difficult to value and trade because they were very idiosyncratic and illiquid, like mortgage loans, for example. The new computer techniques, greater computing power, but also advances in information technology allow these institutions, for example, to engage in securitization of mortgages and turn them into tradable securities. So something as fundamental, basic, and familiar as a mortgage loan, a traditional banking product, suddenly was being able of transformation into a tradable security. In other words, the product itself moved from one silo into another because of technology. But regulation didn't follow that move, precisely because of that sort of siloed, very structurally segmented, kind of technocratic, narrow targeting type of an approach, right? Fintech is actually changing the financial system in much deeper ways, even than the sort of advent of mass securitization or derivatives products that basically allowed much greater trading of pure risk in the financial system. All that wonderful stuff that I worked on back, mea culpa, in the early 2000s, and that brought us the happy ending in October of 2008. That was bad. What's happening now in the world of cryptography and tokenization and virtualization and the switching to automated software-driven decision-making is at least one qualitative level higher in complexity. So these are the 5 ways in which I think fintech is changing fundamentally the way the financial system operates. First of all, it changes the scale and the scope of the financial system. It makes finance bigger. So now all of that technology, the ability to take your phone and on your phone use some app that some technology company created to make an investment, to deposit money, to make a payment, and to do all these kinds of things, it brings in all kinds of new actors into the space, right? It just incredibly amplifies to a great extent the number of transactions and the volume of transactions and the number of people transacting on a daily basis and the number of people offering the ability to transact, right? It becomes a much bigger enterprise to oversee. The second thing is speed, velocity. That's the sine qua non of the entire financial technology claim to fame, right? The whole purpose of all that computing power, of all that sort of digitization, tokenization, is to make it faster, to make it more frictionless or entirely frictionless, so that you don't have to wait for 3 days before the bank actually allows you to use the money you've deposited, some check you've deposited that you've received in payment from somebody, right? So you don't have to wait for 5 days before the payment you sent abroad actually can be used by the recipient, right? Everything can be done in a matter of seconds on the spot. And that's what we want, because we want to make it faster. Trust and power. It makes finance much more technocentric. In the traditional finance, we knew whom we trust, or at least was supposed to trust. Maybe we don't trust necessarily JP Morgan or Citibank, right? But those were the regulated financial intermediaries, financial institutions that were chartered, that were overseen, and that were licensed to take our money, effectuate our payments. We knew that they were essentially trustworthy, or at least more trustworthy than giving a wad of cash to some shady character in the alley, right? But what happens, whom do we trust in the world where algorithm, software makes these automated decisions about, for example, disbursing particular payments or making certain investments, just because in the beginning of you getting involved with that particular software, you have clicked on some button on your phone saying, yeah, I agree to do this, I understand. Do you really understand how that software works? Who is it that created, who wrote that software? What is it that they put into that software? For example, maybe some people understand it, I don't understand it. Does that mean I am still putting my trust blindly in the technology I'm not equipped to understand, right? And what does it mean? Does it give power to somebody who's behind that software? Because software doesn't have a name attached to it of the kind that JP Morgan, for example, does, right? Hard to tell. Transparency and governance, it's changing the level of transparency of the financial system. The rhetoric of crypto finance is that it makes things more transparent because you don't have a big bank hiding behind the walls of proprietary information. Everybody can download that ledger and see and download the software and check how the software works. But of course, that is not necessarily making things more transparent. In fact, it can and it does make things much more opaque and much more complex. And again, we're coming back to the question of like, how is this system governed? We understand the governance of the traditional financial institutions, but we don't necessarily understand the governance in the virtual space, where there are frequently no legal entities actually responsible, technically speaking, for a particular thing. Finally, blurring boundaries. I already talked about it already a little bit, right? So if maybe people in the 1930s or even in the 1950s or even in the 1970s had no problem distinguishing what is a security versus what is a loan or bank deposit, or what is just currency that they use to pay for coffee. Nowadays, with crypto tokens, it's much more difficult to distinguish for a very simple reason. All of those legal categories for financial products, like a security or a bank deposit or currency, all of those tests developed by different courts and different regulators, or maybe by Congress at different times, ultimately go to the economic substance of the relationship that those products embed, right, or convey. So, for example, if it's the kind of an investment where a person invests their own money, somebody else's money, invests some money in a common enterprise, and then expects profit from the efforts of some kind of a manager, we knew this is the kind of relationship that means it's a security, no matter what you call it, for example, right? But tokens, digital tokens, crypto, whatever it is, coins, whatever you call them, it's a token. It's just an empty vessel that can be filled with any kind of substantive economic relationship. That's the whole point of it. That's the beauty of it. You don't want to commit to one particular type of a relationship in one particular type of a vessel. That is the old school, the boomer type of financial instruments, right? The new financial instruments are absolutely malleable, flexible. They give you absolute autonomy to decide. I'm deciding that this is what I'm going to put. This is the concoction I'm going to put inside of this vessel, this empty cart, which is a token. Send it off on that blockchain, which is just the rail through which that token moves, right? And voila, I achieve my goal. And what it does from the perspective of financial regulation and the regulatory paradigm, it blurs the fundamentally important boundaries that form the basis for us for the substantive regulation of specific financial markets and institutions. So this is how it changes the system, right? So what, one person could say, so what? I don't really care. Because as far as I'm concerned, it's a good thing. There are all these microtransactional benefits for individual parties transacting using those new financial technologies, right? Eliminates frictions, increases efficiency, everything is faster. More people can access financial system now because you don't have to qualify for a bank account at JP Morgan. All you need is a phone and just download off of an internet some app, and you can send each other any kind of payments. It's really great. So we don't care about the finance getting bigger or faster or more less transparent or whatnot. But the macro systemic, bigger kind of consequences, right? Not the consequences or implications specifically for the transacting parties, but for the financial system as a whole and the broader society, that's a whole different matter. It's not exactly the same. If it's good for the goose, it's not necessarily good for the gaggle, right? So 5 challenges, those 5 ways in which fintech changes the financial system, you can actually track it to the 5 types of challenges it raises for the paradigm of financial regulation. The scale and scope challenge, speed, velocity, trust, power, transparency, and boundary challenge. So very quickly, the scale and scope, regulatory perimeter, right? Bank regulators are used to dealing with a particular type of regulated entity, which is banks or affiliated companies of banks, right? This is what they know. In this country, we have an inordinately large number of banks, several thousands. Most other countries don't have that many. But even if there are 5,000 or 6,000 banks, it's still a finite number. More importantly, we know what each bank is like, what each bank is like in that group, because all of them have to go through the vetting process, through the chartering process, and so on and so forth, right? Suddenly, the regulatory perimeter blows up, because now the same financial services that banks used to offer can be offered by some tech startup out of Silicon Valley with 2 guys straight out of MIT who have nothing to do with banks, have never learned about bank regulation, moreover, don't care about bank regulators at all, right? And that's what they're doing, because who's there to stop them from doing it, right? This is a free country. Anybody can start offering a product if there is a demand for it, right? So the perimeter grows. That means that now bank regulators have to look at the world, and they do not know anymore where the boundaries are of that sort of the herd that they need to herd, right? There are all these cats out there, and we don't recognize most of them necessarily. Huge diversity of products, services. There are now players in this market that didn't used to be part of that market. We don't know how to deal with that, for example, or the regulators don't know how to deal with that. They lose control over the entry into that particular club that they oversee. And for the banking sector, very importantly, also subsidized, because banks are publicly subsidized. We all know FDIC insurance, but there are also other forms of subsidy. So if you subsidize somebody, right, you better know whom else they're bringing into this club, right? You don't want to be forced to subsidize all kinds of strangers who suddenly snuck into that particular space. And of course, dealing with that sort of unstable, larger perimeter of new actors and new products and new audiences really puts a huge strain on regulatory capacity in terms of their resources and expertise. They don't know how to deal with Silicon Valley technologies, period. That's not the audience to which they used to. The speed velocity challenge, this is the biggest one. So everybody touts the frictionless transaction because this is amazing. I can send money to somebody in Kazakhstan, my old country, right? And it can just hit their account in a matter of seconds as opposed to waiting for 3 days. Amazing. I love it. I've never done it, but I would love to do it. But from the perspective of the financial regulators looking at the system, right? Frictionless transaction can also be called frictionless speculation because it enables speculation that is also frictionless. Because when we discuss innovative financial services, right, it's kind of incredible that the context is always set as something legitimate and good and beneficial and innocent, like one person sending money to another person. Nobody's talking, well, let's imagine that one person is a speculator and another person is a speculator. And this is what we need to make frictionless. Because if you set up your hypo like that, everybody says, that sounds like something we don't want to have, right? But that actually is happening. Frictionless transacting enables frictionless speculation. That is a challenge to the extent that our financial regulatory system is set to stabilize the entirety of the financial market, right? The more speculation there is, the more pressure there is on the public actors to actually adjust their strategies of ensuring macro stability. Compressed decision making, that's another interesting one. So because everything is automated, things are moving so much faster, right? So when something is happening out there in the market, In the old days, right, maybe an investor or an asset manager had a day, a full day, or maybe several hours, or at least 10 minutes to think about how to react to that market movement, right? Should I also sell? Should I also buy? What do I do? Where does that signal come from? Is the market overreacting to some glitch in some obvious glitch in some technological system? Or is there really some bad news that people are learning about and I might be the last one to learn, right? There was some friction, some delay that allowed potential diversity of choices, which actually created resiliency in the market. Now that time for decision making is absolutely compressed because a lot of that decision making actually is already automated in the software that supposedly makes these decisions. So something happens somewhere out there in the market, right? Let's say some big move, some big market player apparently sold a whole bunch of securities, right? And that signal now translates immediately into the cascade of selling that is sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and a downward spiral in the market, right? Because there is no time. And there is often no human being to actually, with the authority to stop and think about it for a second. Why is it a regulatory challenge? Because now the regulators, remember, they are in charge of ensuring macro stability. Think about the Federal Reserve, right? So the Fed people who are watching the market because they're worried about, the value of money and the stability and whatnot, now they have to be able to somehow swoop in and save the market from collapse in a matter of seconds. They don't have the luxury of calling up all those CEOs of all those big Wall Street banks, summon them up into the conference room at New York Fed, sit them around the table and say, this is how this is going to work from now on. As of today, you're going to do X and we're going to do Y to save your butts. There is no space for that anymore. The market is reacting much faster in a much more dispersed fashion. And according to the logic that may not necessarily be visible to the Fed or other regulatory authorities, yet nobody has relieved those authorities from their duty, their obligation to ensure macro stability. So what does that mean? Does that mean that they have to be able to execute preemptive action? How do you preempt those kinds of spirals? Because there is no way you can timely jump in ex post. So you have to be in the market ex ante. What does that mean? Aren't we entering into a whole different area of market participation by the public bodies that used to rely simply on making rules, exercising oversight from the outside, right? That's a challenge. Trust power. The challenge is to identify, to understand where the power resides behind that glossy, the sort of the vision of neutrality that technology portends. Somebody writes that technology. Somebody determines that what that technology will do for whom, right? It's just incredibly difficult to understand the patterns of that power. And, mindset matters because if you think of finance as technology, then you don't even pose that question about the power behind that technology. Finance is technology. It's all objective, scientific, it's neutral, normatively neutral, right? So then you can take your technocratic tools and look for the most narrowest problems and surgically go, and with technology also fix those problems and you are done, right? But if you think of finance as a political economy phenomenon, in other words, all finance is fundamentally political because money is power, right? So if you think about it that way, then it becomes extremely challenging to kind of change your mindset, figuring out where that power resides. Transparency, governability. This is an interesting one because traditionally disclosure has been such an important regulatory tool in the US financial regulation, right? Particularly in securities regulation. Our entire securities regulatory regime depends on disclosure. But think about the assumption behind why disclosure is such a disinfecting light. It's because the assumption is that there are the investors out there creditors and stockholders, they actually are going to process some information that comes from the companies or about the companies, right? Process that information, make that decision individually, rationally, on the basis of what their individual risk aversion levels are or whatever preferences are, right? And then they would act based upon that kind of processed information. Who processes information in this automated world? Is there such a thing as information processing in that sense that the regime of disclosure implicitly assumes to exist? Rather, right, smart contracts are very simple if-then kind of software. They need to rely on very simple quantifiable signal, some trigger that comes from the outside, like a price of a particular instrument has changed, that's the signal, X happened, software immediately executes Y. There is no processing of qualitative disclosure, but even quantitative disclosure. And yet, interestingly enough, anytime there is a debate about how to address some regulatory challenge, how should we regulate X or Y or Z, the safest thing to propose is always more disclosure. Because who's going to say less disclosure is better? Nobody, and it's safe. It's also safe for those who don't want to be regulated effectively. Because it's a yeah, disclosure, fine. Who cares? No one cares about disclosure. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but this is a problem. And there is a complexity of the financial market that also exists on a new qualitative level. The entirety of the financial market, in fact, the vast majority of what we understand as financial innovation really is not about better serving the needs of one counterparty or another counterparty. It really is about amplifying the volume and the sort of the scope of trading in the secondary markets for trading financial instruments. The more financial instruments you can synthesize, create out of the existing sort of fuel, right? The better it is. The more you can trade the assets, the better it is. It's very much a secondary market, trading-driven financial system that we live in today. And crypto and technological sort of those digital assets enable synthesizing tradable assets essentially without any kind of external limit. Because in the traditional kind of way, in the old days, I keep referring to the old days, they were not that old, they're just like 10 years ago, right? Now it's the old world. In the old days, the game was still the same. The Goldman Sachs of the world tried to create, for example, funds, or they try to create asset-backed securities out of the existing assets, right? Like mortgages, for example, or other securities or whatever. So you pool them and you create a new kind of security that can be traded separately from the underlying assets. In other words, you created a second layer of trading, right? But all of those financial structures ultimately depended on the actual mortgage loans being extended to real people who wanted to buy houses. That was sort of a limitation on how many additional layers of securities you could potentially create on top of that, right? The original fuel was still determined by some activity outside of the financial system. But what about cryptocurrencies or crypto assets, right? There is absolutely no need to connect any of those digital assets to anything that happens outside of the crypto universe. Anything physical is entirely irrelevant. So you can take one crypto asset that's basically a bit of information, right? Sitting in whatever creation of a software, and you can use that as your building bricks for synthesizing and creating derivatives on top of it, or securitizing it, or use it as collateral for other things out there, right? You can grow the scope and the scale of trading without being hamstrung by whatever the real economy needs or whatever else is happening in the real economy. And that is incredibly complex situation. So lastly, the boundary challenge. The one thing here is the big tech entry into finance. This is the big challenge, right? Amazon, Apple, PayPal, Microsoft, they are really, they already are inside the financial market because they're really poised to take great advantage of the existing technological platforms that were developed for e-commerce or for various online searching services or whatever they were developed for. Now they create that market power that they can utilize to put on top of it financial services. And this is what is a huge boundary challenge because, for example, if Facebook offers financial services, which it already does, right? What does that mean for financial regulators? They already have enough trouble looking over the securities firms and banks and insurance companies and hedge funds, right? Does that mean they now have to oversee what Facebook is doing as a social media platform so that they can get a better handle on what kind of risks they pose as a financial services provider because their financial services are tied to what happens on their social media platforms, right? International cooperation becomes more necessary because crypto world is boundless. That's the whole point. Doesn't know national borders. But governments are still nation states, right? They have limited jurisdictions. They have to cooperate. And cooperation is more necessary, but also more difficult because there are always some jurisdictions that want to kind of leapfrog ahead of the big bulky United States, for example, right? And become that hub for the world's financial activity because they're small and they're innovative and they're agile. How do you discipline those jurisdictions? How do you cajole them into cooperating to protect your markets? So what does it all show? Of course, these are not unique challenges, but what it means is that the financial regulation has to come out of its that narrow, structurally segmented technocratic shell. It has to become more flexible. Financial regulation has to fill in that greater, much more volatile and dynamic space that is the financial system of today. But instead, most current regulatory responses still follow the same playbook. Very defensive, very reactive, right? Something new is happening in the market. What is the reaction? We need to accommodate it somehow. We need to absorb it into the existing regulatory scheme, right? Or we need to maybe stretch a little bit the existing regulatory scheme just enough to cover just sort of like the edges of that new product, right? And that's how we react. So all these regulatory sandboxes, the innovation hubs, let's allow some of these digital products to be tested without hamstringing them with regulation and see, will they blow up the world? Will they not blow up the world? That was all the rage in the past several years, but not so much now. Now we move to this sort of next stage. Oh, let's create a chartering regime or licensing regime, some regulatory oversight of these new digital assets. But when you look into the proposals, all the proposals are basically, well, let's just take whatever exists in the securities world and just name it something else and call it the digital regulation or crypto regulation or whatever. Mostly disclosure, mostly, maybe capital regulation. That is the banking world, right? Like, we'll make sure that they have enough capital. Maybe. But this is sort of, to me, this is kind of, like trying to put an 18-year-old high school football player into a onesie he used to wear when he was 1 year old, right? He was a different human being then, very different characteristics. Yes, it's still the same. Finance is still finance, but it's not quite the same, right? So RegTech and SupTech, that's another newfangled kind of approach. Well, let's then make regulators just as savvy in the crypto world as the technologists whom they regulate. Let's put all the regulation into code. Let's make software police whatever software does, which is, of course, incredible and amazing. It's just, where would that regulatory software come from? I guess, I can imagine the Wall Street and the crypto industry very helpfully coming to the Federal Reserve, to the SEC and the bankers. Like, we're here to help you. This is the kind of software we're using, and we can help you to create your software that is compatible with our software so you can see in real time whatever it is that we're doing. Would that be a solution? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. So by way of conclusion, we need a fundamental shift in our attitude. We need to shift our paradigm. the technocratic financial regulatory model that served us really well, or maybe not so well lately, but nevertheless served us since at least the 1930s, perhaps is due for serious overhaul. So we need to understand that this borderless and frictionless finance also requires a borderless and frictionless oversight. It has to be more open-ended. The regulatory tools have to be more flexible. We have to look not just at disclosure and enforcement and slapping somebody's hand or whatever, but we have to look at the participatory tools. The Fed may need to be a direct market participant in a much more assertive way than it used to be, not because we want to create some kind of a Leviathan or give too much power to unelected bureaucrats, not because of that, but because otherwise it won't be able to do its job of keeping the stability of the markets that are too fast and can react in a very violent way, and it would be impossible to stop those spirals, right? We need to consider that. And most importantly, we need to start thinking about reincorporating the way we think about financial regulation into our broader thinking about what kind of economy do we want to have. How does the finance that is frictionless and fast and crypto-driven and whatever, how does it or will it at all serve the needs of the real economy? Because so far the trend has been to divorce the development of financial markets from the needs of the real economy, right? The old assumption that the financial system naturally is there to enable real economic actors like real companies, businesses to issue stock, to raise capital, to do X, Y, Z, that assumption doesn't hold anymore. None of that is happening in the crypto space. And even when it starts happening, which it's beginning to happen right now, we don't know yet what implications it would have for the broader economy. And that means we need to rediscover the politics of finance. And that is it. That's what I have to say. I really apologize for taking too long.